Uh, Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on wherever you are. Today, we are extremely lucky to have Professor Joseph Stiglitz. This is the second lecture of Dissecting Capitalism, Season 3, and we are honored that he has considered to deliver this lecture. Now, I would like to request Anisha Chitputi, my partner in crime, to introduce our speaker. Please, Anisha.
Thank you, Satvik. It is a privilege and an honor to introduce our speaker for the day. It is not every day that a young scholar like me gets to introduce a Nobel laureate. We have with us none other than Professor Joseph Stiglitz. It is a pretty Herculean task to enumerate all his academic achievements and accomplishments, so we'll just restrict to a few. He was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001 for his pioneering work on the theory of markets with asymmetric information. For millennials like us, it is hard to imagine economics devoid of this theory, which has become something like shared common knowledge. He has served as the Chief Economist at the Roosevelt Institute and at the World Bank. He has also served as the chairman of the US President's Council of Economic Advisors. He has been named by the Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world for the year 2011. Professor Stiglitz founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank on international development based at Columbia University. His work focuses on income distribution, risk, corporate governance, public policy, macroeconomics, and globalization, to name a few. He's the author of numerous books and several bestsellers. For more details, you can check out the speaker's bio on our event page. So I'll restrict the introduction to just short 2 minutes and welcome, a very warm welcome to you, Professor Stiglitz, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much. What I'm going to do today was a little bit different than the title I gave to the talk. I thought I'd talk about neoliberalism and the way it has shaped our response to the inflation that is going around the world, and use that as a framework for illustrating some basic ideas and how those ideas have shaped thinking and shaped the policy response. I have some slides I want to share, and so let me try to do that now. Let me see if I can, good. Can you all see them? Yes?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
good.
Okay.
So neoliberalism, as all of you know, is the predominant ideology of the past 40 years. It was based on both interest of the wealthy corporate interest, but also was based on simplistic models that economists have put forward. So I think we are not innocent in perpetuating and advancing this neoliberal ideology. What were the core elements of that ideology? It said that there should be small government with limited regulation, that it focused, for instance, on what was supply side economics, so that you should have low taxes, which meant, of course, limited redistribution. The irony, of course, was that there was an element of strong anti-Keynesian. The irony was that Keynes saved capitalism from the capitalists. If you go back to the Great Depression, if it had not been for Keynes, the sentiment against capitalism would have been overwhelming. And yet, as I said, even though Keynes had saved capitalism from the capitalists, they opposed Keynesian ideas. Why? Because it provided a rationale for government They were afraid that if one had a strong government, it might use its powers to engage either in redistribution or restricting their ability to exploit others, restrict their ability to make profits from anti-competitive practices, from taking advantage of vulnerabilities. And what we've seen in the last 40 years, I'll come back to this a little bit later, has not been very good. The neoliberalism hasn't worked. But what I wanted to emphasize to this group is that the neoliberal policies were often disjoint with neoliberal models. And both the neoliberal policies and the neoliberal models were disjoint from the realities. As an example, the standard models, the representative agent models, said that debt didn't matter. Those of you who have studied that literature, it's called Ricardian equivalence. And yet, while the representative agent models, which were at the center of macroeconomics, said that while the model said that debt didn't matter, neoliberal policymakers focused on debt. People like Ken Rogoff argued that if debt exceeded 80% of GDP, there would be severe consequences. Of course, subsequently it was shown that his econometrics was badly flawed. But the theory of the representative agent said that we owed the money to ourselves, and so how could debt matter? Probably the most disjoint from reality were the RBC, real business cycle models, which even denied the existence of unemployment. But while those models lost favor because obviously macroeconomics was created to explain unemployment, the predominant school, New Keynesian DSGE, blamed the victim. They said the problem was wage rigidities. If only workers would accept lower wages, increase inequality, we would be back in the nirvana where there would be full employment. Other strands, of course, of New Keynesian DSG models focused on issues like menu cost, price rigidities, but these, we're focusing on what I view as second order effects rather than first order, and the very vocabulary of menu cost trivialized correctly what they were emphasizing. All these models, whether it was the RBC or all the variants of New Keynesian models, sought the explanation for fluctuations in external shocks. But 2008 and most other downturns, like the Great Depression, showed that in those models, the shocks were endogenous. It was a shock to the banking system, the financial sector, not an exogenous technology shock that gave rise to the economic fluctuations. So they were, to use American euphemism, they were barking up the wrong tree. So given that the models were so disjoint from reality, it's not surprising that neoliberalism didn't deliver. There was lower growth. What growth that did occur went to those at the top. Focusing on two of the key policies, trade liberalization actually enhanced the divides within our society. The work of a group at MIT showed that the China shock led to lower wages, higher unemployment in those parts of the country and those counties that were most exposed to the increase in trade imports in the United States from China. The neoliberal assumption that resources move quickly from sectors where demand was down to sectors where demand was up was shown not to be true. Similarly, financial liberalization led to the deepest downturn in 3/4 of a century. And not surprisingly, all of this had strong political consequences. More recently, the pandemic showed the key role of government. Government was central in innovation, in generating the mRNA platform, and then providing the financial support to the creation of the vaccines, which play such an important role in protecting us from COVID-19. Government played an essential role in addressing the public health externalities in those countries that had more trust in government and where governments were better able to address those public health externalities, actually performed better in terms of fewer hospitalizations, fewer deaths. The United States, where there was not trust in government, has now had more than 1.1 million deaths. And the government also played a central role in sustaining the economy. In the United States, we saw that Keynesian policies actually worked, as they had worked in 2008. There were large multipliers from government spending, if there had not been these large expenditures, the economic downturn would have been very, very severe. We also saw, contrary to the view that had become the dominant perspective in the years up to the crisis of the Great Recession in 2008, we saw once again that fiscal policy was more important than monetary policy. So these series of episodes in 2008 and the pandemic really showed that the weaknesses in neoliberalism, which had strived to minimize the role of government, and when there was government intervention, to limit it to monetary policy, to limit the discretion, those ideas were shown to be wrong. The pandemic and this following and inflation which followed the pandemic shows that we have to go beyond simplistic macroeconomics and the toolbox that has been the basis of that macroeconomics. And there are two aspects of this that I want to emphasize now. The first is that these were sectoral shocks. The service sector was affected much more than the goods sector. In fact, the goods sector expanded even as the service sector contracted. But once we start thinking this way, we realize that the shocks leading to the Great Depression and the Great Recession were also sectoral shocks. In the Great Depression, the agricultural sector was much more worse hit than the urban sector. The point of sectoral shocks is there are large changes in relative prices. And when there are large changes in relative prices, one can't use a simple aggregative model. One has to be selective and thinking about what is the appropriate level of disaggregation. But what is very clear is that a one sector model, which is the standard model that macroeconomists have used, won't be adequate. But there's a second aspect that I really want to emphasize, is that these were unprecedented. We never had a pandemic like that of COVID-19. And just like the downturn of 2008 was unprecedented. We hadn't had a downturn like that in 75, 80 years. And the economy was obviously markedly different. The financial sector played a different role in 2008 than it was then in 1929. The implication of this for an analytic point of view is you can't use stationary stochastic processes, which are the key tool of standard macroeconomics, DSGE models. One can't assume that the economy is in equilibrium, which is the standard assumption of DSGE. Remember, the third initial stands for equilibrium, dynamic stochastic equilibrium models. And it's quite obvious that we were not in any kind of equilibrium. What is key is uncertainty, not intertemporal substitution, which the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models focus on. And with this high level of uncertainty, what is very important is precautionary behavior, including precautionary savings. That is one of the reasons why one has to be very cautious in responding to unprecedented shocks. But even though these shocks were unprecedented, we do know something. Economic science has taught us some things. For instance, it's taught us that there is high unemployment. Fiscal policy is likely to work. We saw that in 2008. We saw that in 2020. More generally, we know that automatic stabilizers can be very effective and work more quickly than discretionary fiscal policy. So the challenge when confronting policymakers, the challenge for confronting policymakers when confronting unprecedented shocks is to identify the idiosyncratic aspects of the shock, and then to ask the question, which effects are going to be transitory, which are going to be permanent? If transitory, how long the effects will last? The key failure of the central banks in responding to the inflation which broke out in 2021 was not acting too slowly, as many of the pundits in the financial press have argued. It was quite the contrary. It was not realizing that this inflation was different from inflation that we've had in the past. It was not due to excess aggregate demand. And by responding in a mechanical way, raising interest rates, assuming that it was a standard inflation, they may have made matters worse. So that was the failure of the central bankers. In the case of economists, in the United States, there's been a very big fight between two groups of economists, one called Team Transitory, which said that the inflation shock was transitory. The other side, led by Larry Summers, said this is a really serious problem. We're going to have to keep the interest rate's high. We're going to have to create high levels of unemployment to get the inflation down because we were slow to act. Both sides made mistakes. The mistake of treating transitory was it failed to recognize that the inflation was less transitory than thought. And that was because they failed to recognize the lack of resilience of the marketplace. In a sense, they had excessive confidence in the market. They thought the market would be able to respond to shortages very quickly. As we'll see in a minute, they were not able to do that. They were not able to produce chips. They were in the United States, we couldn't even get baby formula. There were interruptions in global supply chains. The market proved that it had been short-sighted in building in resilience. Not a surprise. In 2008, we saw that markets were very short-sighted. Financial markets were very short-sighted, and that they did not do a good job in assessing risk. And I think the lesson of 2020, 2021, COVID-19 is that that short-sightedness, the lack of good risk analysis was a characteristic of the entire market economy. As I sometimes put it, we build cars without spare tires. That meant that we saved pennies in the short run at great cost in the long run. And compounding that was the increase in market power. I'm not going to talk in this talk about market power, but we'll see some data showing evidence of that increase in market power. But that market power itself proved important in the lack of resilience. The reason that we had a shortage of baby formula was not that we didn't know how to produce a simple product like baby formula. It was that half the baby formula market in the United States was concentrated in one firm. And when that firm was shown to not be producing in a way that was healthy and safe and was shut down, it created a massive shortage of baby formula. So these were the mistakes that Team Transitory made. But the other side, I think, made much more fundamental mistake. They thought the problem was excess aggregate demand. In part, they alleged caused by excess spending in the pandemic to sustain the economy. They were using simple aggregate models. They didn't realize the sectoral nature of the shock. They didn't realize that increasing interest rates could make matters worse. They didn't realize the role of market power, the lack of resilience. And they, most importantly, thought the changes in the underlying macroeconomic relations, Phillips curve and the Beveridge curve, were permanent, when in fact the United States and most other countries have faced unprecedented shocks. And while we couldn't tell how transitory the effects were, there was good reason to believe that eventually the economy would return to a more normal state. And we are seeing that happening. It's now 3 years since the onset of the pandemic, but variable after variable, like labor force participation, is returning to more normal levels. So what I want to do in the remaining minutes of my talk, I want to hone in on what I call the appropriate response, going beyond the neoliberal response to inflation. So there are 4 parts of what I'm going to say in the next roughly 15 minutes. First, we have to understand the underlying drivers. What were the disturbances to the economy that caused the inflation? The second is, how do we respond to these disturbances and their consequences? And what I'm going to try to argue is that focus on monetary policy is wrong. It will worsen inequality and do little to tame inflation unless interest rates are increased to a level that I believe is unacceptable. And doing that would have long-run adverse consequences. And finally, in the last few minutes, I'm going to talk about a host of better ways of responding to inflation, ways that do a better job at taming the inflation, and at the same time, reduce inequality. And regardless of the model, the inflation estimate of its inertia can have a positive effect on the economy. So to review what I said a few minutes earlier, the basic perspective is this has been an unprecedented disturbance. Because it was unprecedented, it was hard to predict short-term and long-term consequences. And the underlying hypothesis that I brought to the table was that the economy will largely return to prior behavior, but we don't know how long it will take. And policies and our analysis has to be predicated on recognizing that deep uncertainty, not pretending that we have certainty about the nature of the responses to this unprecedented disturbance. And as I mentioned before, the debate in the US has been between those who see it transitory with inflation largely tamed on its own versus the need for a long, painful transition to return to lower inflation rates. I'm going to argue that the transitory perspective is the correct one. We are already seeing that. And the almost gleeful pain that the chairman of the Federal Reserve says we're going to have to feel pain. Of course, he's not feeling the pain. It's workers, particularly minority workers, that are feeling the pain. And I'll hopefully be able to spend a few minutes on that. So beginning on the first part of the analysis, what are the underlying drivers? It's not excess demand, excess savings. In fact, the underlying problem was not excess pandemic spending, and we can't blame excess aggregate demand for the inflation. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just go through the simplest macroeconomic model. Aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. And we're going to look at each component, and we're going to see each component was weak. And when we add them up, aggregate demand is well below was all throughout the inflationary period, well below the levels which would have generated the demand, the inflation that was observed. So beginning with the C, consumption, what we show here is that real consumption was always, for most of the period, and in the period when inflation took off, well below trend, and it only exceeded trend very, very briefly. And real GDP remains below trend. Real government expenditures are well below trend. Aggregate demand was below CBO estimate of potential output. So that could not have been the source of inflation. If we start looking at some other aspects, investment was below trend. Residential investment plummeted. There was large inventory accumulation, again, a sign of weak aggregate demand. So all of this means that it is not excess aggregate demand that was the problem. Now, people on Republicans and some Democrats like Summers blame Biden for excess pandemic spending. But what happened was we had an unprecedented crisis, and we needed to support people who otherwise would have been in terrible shape. We needed to act quickly. When you act quickly, you don't target as well as you might. It's a political issue. It was, you might say, a risk analysis. I think they, in the end, I wish they had targeted it better. If it were up to me, I could have done it, but that's not the way our political process works. But even recognizing that it was not well targeted, the money that went to the upper part of the income distribution was basically saved and did not lead to increased spending. It led to an increase in cash balances. But the interesting thing is the increase in cash balances were primarily caused by the fact that people didn't want to go out and spend because of the precautionary savings. They were uncertain and they didn't want to go to restaurants. So here's a chart showing that while the fiscal support played an important role in excess savings, so did the reductions in outlays. So the high fiscal spending was only part of the cause of excess savings. Now, if we trace what happened, is that as the government spent more and as people were very uncertain, excess savings accumulated. But what we see is that it was spent down very, very gradually. And that's why aggregate consumption did not accelerate in the way that the critics said it would. And in fact, if we look at what was going on, most of the decrease in excess savings, the decumulation, was a result of payment of money on non-withheld taxes, which surged in 2021. If we look at what one might have thought the where the excess spending would have shown up in inflation, you would have thought it would show up in the non-traded goods, because after all, the US is only a fraction, 20% of the global economy. And what we see is that expenditures on the non-traded goods remain did not surge. One way of seeing that that it was wrong to blame the high level of pandemic spending in the United States for U.S. inflation is that the inflation rate in the United States was not that different from other countries that were similar. And there are multiple differences in policies that could account for that. We had not only higher pandemic spending, but much worse pandemic labor policies that resulted in much higher levels of unemployment rate and job separation, we also have much worse working conditions, much worse job protection, much worse health policies. So if it wasn't excess aggregate demand that caused the inflation, what was it? Well, it was pandemic-induced supply-side shortages and pandemic-induced demand shifts. The supply shortages also led to changes in relative prices, which created supply shortages in other sectors. One of the important aspects of what was going on were what I call asymmetric price responses. So those are exemplified by the rental market in the United States. As people zoomed, as people couldn't interact in cities, many people wanted to move out of the cities, and demand for housing outside the cities increased, and demand for housing inside the cities decreased. The overall demand for housing, one might have thought, would have gone down for the obvious reason. We killed off 1 million Americans. We shut down all immigration, and therefore the demand for housing should have gone down. And if we had a completely symmetric price response, that would have meant rental rates, housing costs would have gone down. But there were these asymmetric price responses. That meant the shortages led to much greater price increases than the surpluses in the cities. So the average of price actually went up, and that is now being reversed. And then the other thing that was going on was the supply side shortage and demand shifts. The market couldn't respond. There was this lack of resilience that I talked about before. There was also an exercise of market power. The evidence, some of it by studies at the Roosevelt Institute, showed that prices went up much more in sectors and with firms with more market power. And the Phelps winner, Greenwald-Stiglitz customer market model predicts that greater uncertainty will lead to higher markups as firms focus more on the short-term benefit of raising the prices than on the long-term cost of losing customers. And of course, this market power, as I mentioned before, was a contributing factor to the lack of resilience. Now, all of these pandemic sources of inflation were exacerbated by the war, which led to higher energy and food prices. This shows that the rapid increase in prices, but now that the supply side problems are being addressed, the prices are coming down. The rate of inflation is coming down very dramatically. And interestingly, if you look at the rate of inflation in the United States over the last 6 months, just the 6 months, it's now down to a little over 2%. The way inflation is normally reported is year over year. But if you did it year over 6 months ago, seasonally adjusted, you see that inflation really has come down. Now, that doesn't guarantee that it won't go up again. I don't think we can have confidence that we will remain low. But what it is clear is that there are disinflationary forces at play, and that without increasing unemployment, we brought inflation down significantly. And that is totally inconsistent with the perspective that has been put forward, for instance, by Summers, who, with the perspective of a shift in the Phillips curve, has argued that the only way to bring down inflation was to cause significant increases in unemployment for long periods of time, for 5 years or more. That view has been, I think, by now, totally discredited, and in my perspective, predictably so. When we look at how and when prices increased, what we see is that the price increases centered on certain sectors, and the timing was not related to the gap between aggregate demand and potential output, but of course to sectoral problems. I mentioned before the important role that market power played, and this is consistent with the secular increase in markups that has occurred since 1980. But what one sees is the enormously rapid increase in markups as we went into the pandemic. And that too is reflected in the increase in corporate profits. Now, whatever the source of inflation, whether it's aggregate demand or sectoral, as I've argued, there is a worry that you can get a wage price spiral. One needs to look at the data. Many economists focus on expectations. I'm less convinced of the models that center on expectations. I think they make highly unrealistic assumptions. I don't have time to explain what fully is wrong with those models. But what we know is that as of the current time, inflationary expectations have been very muted. Why? I think the market has analyzed the situation much closer to the way that I've analyzed it than to the way the central bankers have analyzed it. The market have said, this is a supply shock and we'll get over it. Inflation will come down. And that's why they have taken the view that I have, that it's transitory. We can also look at what's happening to wages. There were some adjustment of wages in certain sectors where wages have been very low. The green curve there is the leisure and hospitality sector, where wages were, I think, unacceptably low, and one got high rates of inflation. But that has now been brought down to a very low level. And in other sectors, wage increases have been very tame. And overall, what we see is using the ECI, the Employment Cost Index, wage increases are very tame. One of the points I want to emphasize is that one could actually have wage increases faster than price increases without inducing wage price inflation, because markups could, and I hopefully will, come down. But so far, wages have not kept up with prices. Real wages have actually fallen, not a sign of a typical tight labor market. And there was an article today in the Wall Street Journal describing country after country in which real wages have gone down. So what is the picture today? The picture today is inflation is being tamed. as the pandemic and its effects weaken. Bottlenecks are being resolved, and there are disinflationary forces at play. Oil that was up to 120 has come down. Over the long run, it will come down further. These disinflationary forces are going to be important as sectoral prices normalize. As I said before, inflationary expectations remain tame. Wages are not keeping up with prices, which is not a sign of tight labor market. In any case, there's no evidence of an out of control wage price spiral. Not a surprise given the limited bargaining power of workers. I hope that wages can and should increase at a pace faster that is in the long run sustainable, because the share of labor has gone down. We need to increase real wages back to trend. Markups can and should decrease. Inflation, of course, has seeped into the core. There is some price inflation, and the overall disinflationary prices may be slow. And therefore, it may take a while to get back to the 2% target. But we have to remember that 2% target was totally arbitrary. It was taken out of thin air, the number pulled without any evidence. In fact, models where sectoral shifts are put into focus show that having a higher inflation rate would actually be good, given the asymmetries that in adjustment of wages that I referred to earlier. Not only is the 2% target totally arbitrary, the time to get to the target is even more arbitrary. And the cost of getting there quickly, I think, will be very high. Monetary policy, as I said earlier, is not the right instrument. Once we recognize that the problem is not caused by excess of aggregate demand. Monetary policy doesn't address the underlying source of the problem. It won't resolve the supply bottlenecks. It may make matters worse because it will discourage investment required to resolve them. And in the customer markets, where there are market power that I referred to earlier, increases in interest rates induce firms to raise prices. Furthermore, there is some evidence that in the short run, higher interest rates get passed on in rents in the housing market, which is an important part of the CPI, of the inflation measure, about a third in the United States. Moreover, monetary policy, decreasing aggregate demand, increases inequality, increases unemployment. It hits hard, hitting hardest at marginalized groups. Just to give you an example, the unemployment rate among minority youth is 4 times that of the average. So when the Fed says we're targeting 5% unemployment, what they're saying is we're targeting a 20% unemployment rate among minority youth, with the disastrous effects on our society. Moreover, we know that there can be significant hysteresis effects, so that a misguided policy now will have long-term adverse effect. Globally, the increases in interest rates are even more adverse because it is leading to an increase in the value of the dollar, which is equivalent to a decrease in the value of local currencies. And that increases inflation in other countries. So this is a beggar thy neighbor policy. It weakens the economy in Europe and elsewhere, and it contributes to a global debt crisis, which is brewing. The increased value of the dollar, combined with the slower global growth and higher interest rates, make it even more difficult for those countries that have high levels of debt to meet their obligations. So finally, what I want to argue is that the neoliberal lens has unfortunately focused policy wrongly and not opened up the potential of alternative policies. There are alternative policies, real supply side policies, for instance, increasing green energy, food production. We've told our farmers for more than a half century not to produce food. If we have a shortage of food, well, let's tell our farmers, pay our farmers actually to produce food, and that will lower price of food. We could increase labor supply. As I said, I'm not sure there's a labor shortage. The decrease in real wages is not consistent with a labor shortage. But if there is a labor shortage, let's have better childcare, better family leave policies. Let's increase wages, and let's have immigration reform. One of the problems I've delineated is market power. Let's have stronger and better enforced antitrust policies. We do need to protect people from the effects of inflation. I think we need better protective policies, and these can be financed by windfall profits tax. And actually, you can design these to discourage price increases. Too many countries, I think, have shied away from these windfall profits. We don't have it in the United States. A few European countries have it, but even there, they are neither as strong as they should be or as well designed as they could be. These policies have long-term benefits, even if inflation turns out to be more transitory than seems to be the case now. So with these remarks, I think what I've tried to do is to show how neoliberalism has focused our attention on the wrong models and the wrong policies, and that there are alternative policies that could do a much better job at increasing societal welfare in a very broad way. So with that, let me open up to questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. So now I will open up the Q&A. As you can see, there are so many questions. You have to excuse me how I use my dictatorial power as a moderator of the Q&A. So Jay, please ask your question first.
Yes.
Jay?
Hello, Professor Stiglitz. It's so good to see you again. My question refers to drawing parallels to war economies, particularly 1940. So obviously, we have major displacements of labor, supply chains being displaced, an active role of government in price controls and other interventions. So I'm wondering to what degree when we talk about inflation, we need to account for these types of dynamics transitioning out of a war economy. And therefore, my question is, how do you see parallels in organizing this transition, maybe from a post-war period, the New Deal era, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jay. First, let me say that what we should have learned from the wartime economy is that prices are good in the price system in making marginal adjustments, but not the large adjustments that we associate with big changes like going to war or the big deindustrialization. Markets on their own don't do a good job. And so we can't rely on the price system. Anybody who has studied the Error-Debreu model understands why. We don't have a full range of prices, state contingent, locations, sector contingent that we need. Time is of the essence. Prices don't convey the urgency, just like they don't convey the urgency of responding to climate change. And that's why when we go to war, no country relies just on prices. In responding to the pandemic, many countries realize this. The United States passed 50 years ago something called the Defense Production Act, DPA. And we realized that there can be times of emergency where we need stronger government action. And other countries like Australia have similar frameworks. And so when the pandemic came, we told certain companies they had to produce ventilators. Other countries said they had to, told their companies they had to produce tests or masks. We had shortages and the market just didn't respond fast enough. And one could understand that in some sense. The market didn't understand, didn't know how long it was. They didn't want to take the risk. We didn't want them to deliberate for 6 months while they said, is this going to be profit making or not profit making? We needed we needed the mask, we needed the ventilators, we needed the vaccines right away. So we didn't rely on the price system. I think that we should have used that in responding, for instance, to the energy shortage. We should have used that to make sure that we expanded more rapidly the production of green energy, which would have been a long-term and short-term solution to the problem posed by the shortages that the Russian invasion of Ukraine caused. In Europe, though, there's a different set of problems. They mistakenly had adopted a pricing structure for electricity that was based on normal times. So the price of electricity is related to the marginal cost. And that's fine if you're using day of time pricing, you're trying to smooth prices over the course of the day or maybe other short-term period. That marginal cost pricing system didn't even work well in the United States and California, where it was used and it led to supply shortages. I would have thought that Europe would have learned the lesson of the failures in California and been much more cautious about doing so. But it didn't. So that's played a role in the enormous increase in electricity prices. You know, take Norway, a country rich in resources. We know, hydro, gas, oil, and yet electricity prices went up 9-fold. It was because of the peculiar pricing structure. And Europe didn't realize that it was wartime and they needed a better pricing structure. They could have used nonlinear pricing, they could have used price caps. There were many things they could have done. And this would have had enormous benefits, preventing bankruptcies, and especially of small and medium-sized firms, but even the largest energy producer in Germany went bankrupt. So the whole thing was a misguided pricing system or reliance on a peacetime pricing thing for I'm more cautious about using price controls. The reason I'm more cautious, you get shortages and circumvention very quickly. So one has to be very cautious in the market intervention. We have very sophisticated markets that are very good at circumventing whatever regulation. So we need caution in what we do, but we cannot pretend that we are acting as if we're in peacetime.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. So I will go to the next question. Luis, I am asking you to unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself? No? Okay. The question is, what is your opinion, the long-standing debate between the rules and discretion in both monetary and fiscal policy? Do you believe that central banks should coverage towards the control and management of the policies that follow some kind of rule, just as government should with their public spending?
Yeah, that's a great question, rules versus discretion. And I hinted at my view on that, that the disturbances that we face, most of them are in one way or another idiosyncratic. If we think about what's happened in just the last quarter century, we had the 9/11, we had the Great Recession 2008, we had a big disturbance caused by the election of Trump, we had the pandemic, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 5 big events, all idiosyncratic, none of them described by the DSGE models. So we have to, in each of these cases, think about what do we know and what don't we know? And if we have good rules, they help us focus on the idiosyncratic. And that's why I talked about the importance of automatic stabilizers. We know almost always that when the economy gets weak, unemployment gets greater, we ought to intervene with stronger fiscal policy. And we can do that through unemployment insurance. We can do that through lending programs. We can have automatic responses to economic downturns. And if we have these automatic responses to economic downturns, then we can use discretion to direct our attention to the idiosyncratic aspects. So in this particular case, what is idiosyncratic? Well, the disturbance was a pandemic that we never had. It was affecting one sector, the service sector, more than other sectors. We ought to respond to the fact that there are going to be some people who are more vulnerable. It was a health crisis. And so we have to respond to the problems in the health sector. It was a disturbance happening at a time where interest rates were already low, so monetary policy was not likely to be very effective, and so fiscal policy was likely to be needed. So my view was very strongly that there needed to be discretion, but within a with careful thought to the idiosyncratic aspect. Unfortunately, the Fed pretended that it ought to be obeying a rule like the Taylor rule. Inflation is up and therefore interest rates ought to go up. That was a mistake. So it would have been far worse if it had tied its hand to the Taylor rule. So it really needed more discretion, not less discretion. And we should have had a more coordinated macroeconomic response. In my mind, had we had the right policy framework, we would not have had to spend as much time debating an increase in unemployment insurance. That was obvious that we should have had. We should have had to debate that. What we should have debated was how much need did we have to have for the health sector, for particular parts of the economy that were are particularly adversely affected by these very idiosyncratic shocks that we are experiencing.
Thank you, Professor. So, Claudia, I'm asking you to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was not
Please be
eager.
brief. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I'm going to wrap it up some questions because I have a question about the real estate, and we have some questions about housing policies. I mean, my question was or is about the link between the real estate behavior and this long-term inflation situation. And then I wanted to think about policies. I mean, policies that we could introduce to moderate the real estate effects. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me make a couple comments first. The way we measure inflation in the real estate sector doesn't reflect the real cost of living. And this is important because housing is in various countries 30%, 35% of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So mismeasuring the cost of housing has big consequences. Why do I say mismeasures? Let me talk for the United States. It differs for different countries. We use an imputed cost of housing, even though 70% or so, a little bit less than 70%, 60 some percent of Americans live in their own home. Living in your own home, they own their home, means that when rental rates go up, what they pay doesn't go up. What we do is we impute what the rent would be if they were renting. But of course, the rental market doesn't really, is a small fraction of the total housing market, is concentrated in certain parts of the country, in cities. And so most people, cost of housing is not related to rental prices, and rental prices are not representative even of what they would be paying if they were paying rents. Because of the idiosyncratic nature of the rental market. So what it forgets that if houses price goes up and rental rates go up, you as the owner of the home are better off because the value of your house has gone up. You as the renter of the home are worse off, but it's a wash. And so the welfare effects are zero or very, very low. So the housing component of CPI is not a reliable indicator of the cost of living of most Americans, and this is true of most, but not all countries. Secondly, even the rental rate is a lagging indicator of what is happening, because when most people have a year, 2 year, 3 year lease. And so what we measure is the average rental rate. But if the rental price goes down today, it won't show up. It only shows up after a year or 2 or 3 years as people renew their leases. Now we know from Mazzillo, as an example, what is happening to rentals right now, and they're going down. And so that shows that the lagging nature of the rental indicator, that's in CPI. So that's the first point I want to make, that the way we measure it isn't fully reflective of standards of the cost of living. But we do, the second point I want to make is, I showed it in a chart, raising interest rates decreases investment in housing. Not a surprise. So if you are concerned about housing prices, rental costs, raising interest rate is exactly the wrong policy. That's why I say it exacerbates the problem. It means that housing prices will go up because people recognize that there will be even more shortage in the future, and that will raise housing prices today, and that will get reflected, passed on to rental rates. So what the central banks are doing is exacerbating this problem. Now, it turns out that in many countries, it is very hard, in cities particularly, to get affordable private housing. And many countries, I think, have been successful in developing good publicly provided housing. And the city of Vienna, for instance, has been very successful in doing so. I think, other countries, it has been a failure. I think those countries where it's been a failure need to study more carefully the countries where it's been a success to try to understand what makes for a successful public housing program, because there are very few instances where, in the absence of a public program, there is affordable housing for those of low income.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. So, Zubair, I'm asking to unmute yourself and ask the question by yourself, please.
All right, I'm unmuted. Professor Stiglitz, always a pleasure to talk to you and hear you. But before I ask you the question, may I just take the liberty of wishing you a belated happy birthday? I see you've just turned over the 80th. So
thank you.
So I'm going to scope out a bit, because I think this discussion was focusing so squarely and so interestingly on a wide range of angles. But I see that you, in the earlier part of your presentation, you were also talking about, the Keynesian side, or how we should also now start thinking about, if I may say so, a more reinvigorated role of the state, or a more reinvigorated capacity of the state to deliver on the challenges that we are seeing, which are only compounding with time. You indulged in a great detail about, how.
Can you please ask your question?
Yes. Now my question is mainly about financing. So when we talk about sustainable development in particular, especially for the rest of the world, in times like these, where most of the countries post-pandemic are facing mounting debt crises, and their fiscal outlooks are looking no better, what kind of policy options do they have? If you could just give a few thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's go back just a minute. In response to COVID-19 and the pandemic downturns, the developed countries spent an enormous amount. The United States spent more than 25% of GDP. The developing countries just didn't have the resources. And those that were very badly affected by the pandemic itself saw very large decreases in their GDP, like countries like even emerging markets like Argentina, because they weren't able to finance the necessary Keynesian response. Going forward, I think the um, there is a ongoing agenda called financing for development at the UN. And I've argued that we need to rethink each of the pillars of finance for development. We need more global financing through the multilateral development banks, particularly for climate, for global public goods. Equity, a key reform that we need is in the investment agreements, which make those investments very risky for developing countries because of the intrusion of investor state ISDS. We need better multinational taxation of the corporations. The corporations come into the country, but they don't pay their taxes. And globalization has provided wide scope for tax avoidance. We need, on the debt side, a reform of the way of resolving cross-border debt, including sovereign debt. These reforms, I think, would enhance the flow of funds to developing countries. But I think developing countries should put a greater effort in increasing their savings. If we go back to what was the source of success of the East Asian countries, one of the sources of success was their high savings rate. Hard to figure out how to do that, but I think that relying more on domestic resource mobilization is critical.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. So there was one question, but the person who have asked the question is not here. So I will ask Claudia. Claudia Costa, would you like to ask the question? No? Okay, the question that was asked.
Hey.
Claudia, please.
I already did my question about housing.
Okay, you don't want to ask? Very good. So the question was, the UK's central bank is stuck within their orthodox option in dealing with inflation. So do you have anything to share on that position that the central bank of UK has taken?
I didn't hear, what is their position?
This very short question is that they want to target inflation. So they have taken a very orthodox position.
Oh, so yeah. No, I responded to that more generally, that inflation targeting, which means that you increase the interest rates when inflation increases, is not appropriate when the source of inflation is a sectoral shock, such as the kind that we've had today. That increasing interest rates can actually be counterproductive. Now, what I said is, if you raise interest rates enough, you can cause a serious enough economic downturn that you will bring down inflation. But the cost is enormous and unnecessary. It is far better to use fiscal policy, and I would say targeted monetary policy. What do I mean by targeted monetary policy? What I mean is not increasing the interest rates, but saying, okay, we have a shortage of chips, or a shortage of energy, or a shortage of housing. We will provide more credit. We will facilitate banks lending more to those parts of the economy where there are supply shortages. The underlying point here is that there are large macroeconomic externalities that firms in each of these sectors don't take into account. The real business cycle theories and the DSGE models do not adequately take into account macroeconomic externalities. And the kind of sectoral approach that I've advocated, these macroeconomic externalities are absolutely central. And that provides the justification for a kind of sectoral response to inflation. The across-the-board response of just raising interest rates is totally inappropriate.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. So Bruno, can you ask your question very quickly?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I would like to thank you for this webinar. It was very insightful. It was very, very, very great. I liked it a lot. Well, my question is, when you propose to build new models, do you like think about like reformulating economics, like from its foundations, like rebuilding all of it, like the model from scratch, or do you mean like we should create another like extensions to our current theoretical framework? Yeah.
That's a good question and hard to answer in a simple way. First, let me say, I think there needs to be a fundamental reformulation moving away from DSGE models. I think I've already explained that dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models are flawed because first they assume equilibrium. We're clearly not in equilibrium. They don't explain how we get to equilibrium. In fact, normal decentralized adjustment process are disequilibrating. That was the central message of Keynes. So they've assumed away the central problem of macroeconomics. So we need to focus on disequilibrium. Secondly, when you talk about stochastic, it is not a stationary stochastic process as they assume. It is not an exogenous shock as they assume. It is idiosyncratic shocks of the kind that I've described, with the central issue is response to uncertainty, precautionary savings, precautionary investment, not intertemporal allocation. That is the first order issue. So I guess I would say, in summary, that they focused on absolutely the wrong issues. And the result is they're, in the short run, they're not useful. And in the medium term and the long term, we want to focus, in the medium term, we want to talk about sectoral reallocation. And they're not useful for that because they're too aggregate. And in the long term, we want to talk about sources of economic growth, and they're not useful for that. So my view is they are not useful either for short-term, medium-term, or long-term, and that there are better approaches. Now, we use some of the tools. We use production functions, we use learning functions, we use, so some of the, it's not like we begin from scratch. We have a lot of the tools in our toolkit, but they have to be put together in a fundamentally different way.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. One more question, if you please allow us. Diana, you can ask the question if you want to.
Yes, thank you so much. So my question is just a very short question, and it's a follow-up of the housing question. So you said that without a government plan, affordable housing for people with low income is not possible. But considering that during the pandemic and in this aftermath, wages didn't keep up, that impacted the rental market, also mortgages. What would you say are alternative policies that could directly help us pick up the pieces from that?
Yeah, no. So Dana, you're right that the problem is probably even worse now than it was before the pandemic, because housing interest rates have gone very high because of the increase. I mean, it has led to higher mortgage rates, and there's a decreased housing supply because it's discouraged investment. I think in the medium term, in short term, we may need to have housing supplements. I talked about before protective policies. By protective policy, using windfall profits taxes, for instance, to help lower income people meet their housing costs. In the medium term, I'm increasingly believing that we need a variety of forms of public housing. And that's why I said we have to learn from those countries that have successful public housing programs, the best way to do that. I am particularly concerned about cities because cities are where an increasing fraction of our population lives. And if we don't do something, we will wind up with increasingly economically segregated cities. That has implications for education, for societal interactions. We know that, evidence that when groups don't interact, they get more polarized. So in my mind, there are externalities associated with the structure of cities. And therefore, I think we need to have urban housing policies that include the public provision, subsidization of housing, so we can have economically integrated communities.
Thank you very much for your time, Professor Stiglitz. So now I'd like to ask Anisha to say a few final words. Thank you, Professor, for your time. Anisha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Satvik. First and foremost, I would say it was an experience to be part of this lecture series. And thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz, for letting us have this experience of hearing you. And I think I speak on behalf of the entire community when I say we're very grateful and thankful and honored to have you with us. I would also like to thank all the participants for their invigorating questions and insightful thoughts. I hope you will continue to engage with us for other sessions as well. Thank you so much to all the YSI team that made this event possible, Satvik, Jay, Arun, and the other team members of YSI South Asia. Thank you so much. And I will leave you with a quote by Professor Stiglitz. Changing paradigms is not easy. Too many have invested too much in the wrong models. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Did I miss any question? I don't know. There were so many. I just got flooded, and then I was accepting, waiting people to get in. Okay. Yeah. Thank you all for joining us. We have another session actually next few days. Utsav Patnaik would be talking about imperialism. So if you're interested, please join us. Yeah. That was long, but it was nice.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
See
you,
on the other side.
Devi. Ashmita,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Ashmita, where is Ashmita? Ashmita. Unmute yourself, Ashmita.
Hi,
Hello, Ashmita. How are you?
how are you all? I'm so sorry for not attending all the mandate meetings. I've been so busy with work, I can't tell you. But thank you guys for organizing this session. It was really, really very insightful because this question had been bugging me for a very long time about this inflation and how to, sort of deal with it. So it was a very well organized session, guys. Kudos to you.
Hello, Devi and Joseph. Joseph, if I'm pronouncing correctly. I think we know Lakshmi, right? Lakshmi, we met at IIT. Hi, Lakshmi.
Hi, Sabri.
So guys, don't miss out on our next session, which is on the 27th.
Yeah, if you can. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. See you guys
Yeah.
then. Take
See
care.
you, Anisha. We have
Bye.
to close it now. I'm like,
Yes.
going to follow.
We will close
Bye-bye.
it
Thanks for
and
joining.
bye.
Thank you all. Yeah. Bye-bye. Thank you, Anisha. Thank you. Bye. I was missing your message, Sorry. Yeah. Bye. I have to close.